Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight we journey to the quiet streets of medieval Bologna, where towers rise like stone candles above the sleeping city. The air hums softly with the memory of footsteps and faint bells, and the rooftops glimmer under a pale, watchful moon. Some say that, long ago, lights flickered high in those towers, small flames carried upward by proud families, their glow trembling like reflections on still water. From the dark fields beyond the walls, travelers would see these distant sparks and wonder if the city itself was dreaming. So before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe, only if this brought you calm. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. When medieval visitors approached Bologna, they often saw something curious before they even entered the gates. Rising above the rooftops were towers, dozens upon dozens of them, pointing into the sky like a forest of stone. By day they cast long shadows, but by night some of these towers gleamed faintly, their upper chambers glowing with lamplight, an improvised illumination that earned them the nickname Moon Towers. In a world without electricity, the idea of towers glowing above a city felt like magic. Yet behind this glow was no miracle, only the eccentric ambitions of Bologna's ruling families, who seemed intent on turning the skyline into a contest of height, wealth, and endurance. The origins of these towers lay in rivalry. Beginning in the 12th century, noble families of Bologna built towers as both homes and fortresses, symbols of status in a city that pulsed with conflict. Each family wanted to be seen, and in medieval Italy visibility was power. To build a tall tower was to proclaim superiority, to cast a literal shadow over your rivals. Some towers soared as high as 90 meters, their stone and brick bodies rising above the crowded streets below. Bologna at its peak may have boasted close to 100 of these structures, giving it the appearance of a porcupine bristling with stone quills. But towers were not only for show. Inside, families lived in stacked chambers, climbing steep stairways that wound upward through narrow shafts. The ground floor might hold storage and guards, the middle levels domestic rooms, and the top a chamber with wide views across the city. Defensive in nature, the towers were designed to withstand siege, their upper stories fitted with narrow windows for shooting arrows or dropping stones. Yet in peacetime, they became stages for spectacle. Families hosted guests in upper rooms, where the city stretched below in miniature, and where candles or oil lamps could be placed in high windows to cast a glow across the night. This glow became part of Bologna's strange beauty. In a city otherwise dark, after sunset, the sight of lamps glittering from the towers must have seemed almost celestial. Travelers compared them to stars fallen to earth, or to moons hovering above a rooftop. The tower's light was modest, a few flickering flames carried high into the night, but against the deep dark of medieval streets it was enough to dazzle. Residents called them Torri della Luna, moon towers, because their glow seemed to echo the pale light of the sky itself. Of course, the glow was not entirely aesthetic. Families who lit their towers after nightfall were making a statement. To shine from above was to assert presence, to remind neighbors of wealth, to broadcast security. A tower glowing at night meant its family was powerful enough to afford oil and bold enough to waste it visibly. In a society where light itself was a form of currency, to illuminate the skyline was the equivalent of throwing coins from a balcony. It was extravagant and necessary and unforgettable. Yet, for the people below, the towers were both marvel and menace. Shadows loomed across narrow streets, and falling debris from construction or conflict could kill passers-by without warning. The towers dominated not only the skyline, but the psychology of the city. Citizens lived in their presence, craning their necks upward daily, measuring the hierarchy of families by the height of stone above their heads. Resentment simmered alongside awe. The towers were symbols of ambition, but also of arrogance, reminders that the city's elite had turned Bologna into a vertical battlefield. Inside the towers, life was less romantic than the glowing skyline suggested. Rooms were narrow, cold in winter, and stuffy in summer. Climbing the endless stairs was exhausting, especially for servants who hauled food, water, and firewood to upper levels. Families often lived under constant tension, aware that the tower was both their fortress and their prison. In times of feud, rival families might attack, forcing defenders to retreat upward, cutting off staircases or barricading themselves near the roof. To live in a tower was to live in anticipation of conflict, with wealth and status balanced uneasily against the possibility of sudden violence. The glow of the moon towers softened these tensions slightly, at least in memory. Chronicles describe the towers at night as almost dreamlike, their lamps casting trembling halos across rooftops. For travelers arriving after dusk, Bologna must have appeared like a constellation turned upside down, its stars embedded in brick and stone. The effect was both eerie and enchanting, a glimpse of modernity centuries before electric light. Yet behind the enchantment lay the stubborn reality of aristocratic pride, each lamp a reminder of rivalry carried into the sky. The towers also became landmarks of identity. Just as Venice was known for its canals and Florence for its dome, Bologna became known for its forest of towers. Poets wrote of their beauty, even as civic leaders fretted about the danger they posed. For the city government, the towers were both advertisement and headache, symbols of prosperity, but also of disorder. Regulations were passed, attempts were made to limit their height, yet families continued to build higher, as though bound by some collective compulsion. At night, the glow of the moon towers softened this rivalry into something almost communal, and citizens might curse the families by day, but by night they could not help looking upward, drawn to the trembling flames that gave the city its strange nickname. Bologna's skyline became theatre, each tower an actor lit faintly against the darkness, each flame a signal of wealth disguised as beauty. And so, the moon towers rose and glowed, their fragile flames trembling against the wind, their shadows stretching long across narrow streets. Bologna's nights were lit, not by civic generosity but by aristocratic rivalry. Yet the result was unforgettable, a medieval city that shimmered like a constellation brought to earth, drifting further into the skyline of Bologna. The towers revealed themselves, not merely as architecture, but as characters in their own right, aloof, stubborn, and slightly absurd. Each was built to impress, to intimidate, and to rise just high enough above the neighbor's structure to make the point. By day, they stood as fortresses. By night, they glowed faintly with lamplight, the so-called moon towers shimmering like misplaced stars above a city otherwise swallowed by darkness. Life on the ground floor of Bologna was anything but celestial. The streets were narrow, the air thick with the smells of markets, animals and humanity packed into close quarters. The glow above offered no comfort to those dodging chamber pots, emptied from windows or skirting piles of refuse in alleys. The towers might glitter faintly, but the city beneath was a muddle of noise, barter, and complaint. That perhaps was the point. From above, the noble families could imagine themselves above the stench, above the noise, living in rarefied air, perfumed with oil and smoke. The tower's construction was itself a feat of stubbornness. Built of brick and stone, often on foundations far too shallow for their eventual height, they leaned and shifted precariously. Builders compensated by thickening the lower walls, sometimes to several meters, leaving the interiors narrow and almost claustrophobic. Servants climbed endless staircases, carrying water in buckets and firewood in bundles, sweating as they ascended spirals that seemed designed to break backs. The noble families themselves rarely touched these burdens. They sat in upper chambers warmed by braziers, sipping wine and congratulating themselves on their superiority, while those who actually kept the fires burning wheezed below in shadow. At night, the lamps turned the towers into symbols of extravagance. Oil was expensive, candles costly, and yet families insisted on burning them high above the rooftops where they provided little practical illumination to anyone. The symbolism mattered more than the light itself. A glowing tower meant wealth, control, and endurance. It whispered to rivals, "We can afford to waste what you must hoard." To ordinary citizens, it was both fascinating and infuriating, like watching someone throw coins into a river simply to prove they could. The glow also changed the way people experienced the city at night. In most medieval towns, darkness was nearly total once the sun set, broken only by torches, hearths, or the rare lantern on a civic building. Bologna, however, had its vertical lights. Travelers wrote of approaching the city after dusk and seeing a cluster of faintly shining pillars in the distance, as though the city itself had grown candles. The towers gave Bologna a kind of nocturnal identity, one that set it apart from other Italian cities. The name Moon Towers was not just poetic but practical. They really did echo the pale presence of the moon, casting a glow that felt uncanny in a world unused to nightlight. Yet, the towers were not only symbols of wealth, they were also hazards. Fires were constant threats, especially when lamps flickered in high windows. Wind could tip flames into curtains, and the height of the structures made it nearly impossible to extinguish a blaze once it began. Falling debris, tiles, bricks, even flaming timbers, sometimes rained down onto streets, crushing or burning those unlucky enough to be below. Families insisted on keeping their towers lit, even when the risk was obvious, because the glow was too important to abandon. Prestige demanded danger. The rivalry among families kept pushing towers higher, but civic leaders grew nervous. By the 13th century, the city government attempted to regulate the height of new constructions, partly to curb danger, partly to reassert civic over private authority. Yet, enforcement was uneven, and the towers continued to rise. The skyline became a testament, not to unity, but to discord. Each noble family competing in masonry, brick by brick, to prove supremacy. The glow at night was less a sign of community than a series of private beacons, flaring into the dark to declare victory in a contest no one ever truly won. Inside the towers, domestic life was practical rather than glamorous. Families cooked in smoky kitchens, stored grain in lower rooms, and huddled in chambers warmed poorly by braziers. The upper rooms offered views and prestige, but little comfort. Servants carried hot food upward only for it to arrive cold. Water spilled as it sloshed along staircases. Children tripped on steep steps in the dark. The glow visible from outside hid the daily inconveniences inside. To outsiders, the towers were luminous. To insiders, they were drafty, creaking monuments to pride. And yet, for all their flaws, the Moon Towers gave Bologna a reputation. Foreign travelers wrote of the city as one of towers, its skyline unmatched in Italy. Some admired the beauty, others mocked the excess. A few compared it to a forest turned upside down, its branches pointing not to the sky, but planted stubbornly in it. Whatever their opinion, no one forgot the sight. The towers, lit faintly at night, burned themselves into memory more effectively than any statue or cathedral. So Bologna lived beneath its strange constellations, stone shafts, lit with trembling flames, glowing faintly in the medieval dark. Families squabbled, servants sweated, citizens grumbled, but the skyline gleamed, unforgettable in its absurdity. The moon towers stood as both pride and folly, a reminder that human ambition always reaches upward, even if it means balancing lamps on precarious stacks of brick, sliding deeper into the life of Bologna's moon towers. One notices how their glow seeped into the rhythm of the city itself. For most medieval towns, the night was a time of near total darkness, a velvet cloak that brought silence, caution, and an early retreat indoors. Bologna, however, carried a peculiar shimmer, its towers pricking holes in the night. This faint glow reshaped how people thought about the city after sunset, creating both comfort and unease. From the street level, the towers were imposing even in darkness. Narrow alleys wound between high walls, and when the lamps above flickered, the shadows stretched like fingers across cobblestones. Pedestrians walking home late might glance upward, catching sight of trembling flames high in the sky, reminders of the noble families who lorded over them. These lights provided no practical illumination for the streets below. If anything, they highlighted the disparity between the glowing heights and the murky ground. But for those below, the lights were symbols, both reassuring and irritating. They signaled that the city was alive, awake, and watched, even if the watching eyes belonged to families who cared little for commoners' struggles. The towers also influenced how outsiders perceived Bologna's order, or lack of it. Merchants arriving after dark described the city as glittering faintly, unlike most places where night meant stumbling blindly toward a tavern. But they also noted the arrogance of the glow, each lamp belonging not to the city as a whole, but to individual households. Bologna's towers were not street lamps, they were boasts. They lit the skyline but left the streets dark, a perfect metaphor for private power eclipsing public good. Inside the towers, nights carried their own rhythm. Families gathered in upper rooms, the glow from their lamps spilling out of narrow windows into the night. These gatherings were not always peaceful. Feuds between families often spilled into the darkness, with insults shouted from one tower to another, lamps brandished like signals or challenges. It was as if the towers themselves had voices, their glowing windows blinking like angry eyes across the rooftops. Citizens below must have groaned at these spectacles, forced to live beneath families who turned their homes into vertical stages for rivalries that never ended. The practical dangers of the glow never went away. Oil lamps were unstable, their flames easily tipped by wind. Towers built hastily or poorly maintained leaned ominously, some visibly tilting against the skyline. When fire broke out, and it often did, it spread quickly, consuming wood floors and staircases, sending flaming debris tumbling into the streets. Neighbors rushed with buckets of water, but once a tall tower burned, there was little hope of saving it. Bologna's chronicles note collapses with grim brevity, yet one imagines the chaos: stone cracking, families screaming, flames licking into the sky that the lamps once only mimicked. The city government, caught between admiration and alarm, attempted to assert control. Regulations limited new construction, and fines were levied against families whose towers endangered the public. Yet enforcement was inconsistent. as magistrates themselves were often allied with or beholden to the same noble families who owned the towers. Civic pride coexisted uneasily with civic resentment. The towers gave Bologna a reputation, but they also made it fragile. The glow might have impressed travelers, but to locals it was both a blessing and a curse. Still, the moon towers became woven into the identity of the city. Students at the university, which by the 13th century was famous across Europe, used them as landmarks when wandering home after debates and quarrels in taverns. Lovers met under their shadows, arranging secret trysts in alleys, bathed faintly in reflected glow. Priests looked up at them after evening prayers, perhaps seeing in the glow a reminder of the celestial order. Even cynics could not quite ignore them. The towers had become more than buildings. They were symbols stitched into the daily fabric of Bologna's life. The irony, of course, was that the glow that gave them their beauty also revealed their folly. Each lamp burned oil that might have warmed a household hearth. Each candle consumed wax that might have lit a scholar's desk. To keep lamps glowing so high above the city was extravagance of the purest sort. Light deliberately wasted to prove superiority. Families were not trying to illuminate. They were trying to intimidate. Bologna's skyline was a contest written in flame, its towers glowing not for the people but against one another. Yet, perhaps that was the strange genius of the moon towers. In the time when cities were dark, Bologna was memorable precisely because it shimmered. The glow was pointless, impractical, even dangerous, but unforgettable. Travelers carried stories of Bologna's luminous skyline across Europe, spreading its reputation as the city of towers. Even if the light came from rivalry and pride, it cast Bologna in a kind of medieval starlight, a constellation rooted not in the heavens but in brick and oil. And so, Bologna's nights remained unique, its streets dark but its skyline shimmering faintly, its people muttering curses even as they craned their necks upward. The moon towers glowed not for utility but for memory, ensuring that the city's arrogance was also its legacy. Drifting higher into Bologna's skyline, the towers begin to feel less like practical homes and more like declarations chiseled in brick. Each family seemed intent on shouting vertically, their voices carried upward by masonry. The result was a forest of towers, clustered so thickly that some streets lived in perpetual shadow. By night, the glow from lamps high above softened their outlines, turning this thicket of ambition into something dreamlike. Yet the dream was never gentle for those living beneath it. Citizens in the streets had a complicated relationship with the towers. They admired them, certainly. Who could deny the sight of a skyline that glittered faintly when the rest of Europe slumbered in darkness? But admiration soured quickly into irritation. Towers meant danger, loose stones that fell into alleyways, collapsing walls when storms hit, or the ever-present risk of fire from lamps left burning in drafty chambers. And towers meant arrogance. Every flame that shimmered above was a reminder that noble families burned oil for spectacle, while commoners rationed it carefully, saving each drop for cooking or prayer. By day, the towers were stages for rivalry. Neighbors craned their necks, arguing over which stood taller, which leaned more dangerously, which was built on foundations foolishly shallow. Children used them as landmarks, students as meeting points, merchants as metaphors. By night, the glow softened those rivalries into silhouettes. Families might boast endlessly about their towers, but once the lamps flickered on, they were indistinguishable from one another, just tall shafts of stone shimmering faintly in the dark, each trying to outshine the others but blending into a collective constellation. Inside, The towers carried a paradox of prestige and discomfort. Noble families sat in upper chambers surrounded by fine tapestries and braziers. Yet even luxury could not disguise the narrowness of the space. The walls pressed close, the ceilings creaked, and staircases turned every errand into a small ordeal. Servants bore the brunt, climbing endlessly with water, food, and firewood. Their sweat kept the lamps glowing in the night windows, yet their names rarely made it into the chronicles. The glow of the moon towers was not just oil, it was human labor burning invisibly in the shadows. Foreign travelers often wrote about Bologna's towers with a mixture of awe and confusion. Some compared them to minarets, others to trees of stone, others still to a city that had decided to grow vertically instead of horizontally. At night they described the glow as otherworldly, calling Bologna a city of moons, a place where the night sky seemed to have descended into the streets. But even the most enchanted visitors noted the impracticality. These were not civic beacons, not lights to guide the weary traveler or to make streets safer. They were ornaments of rivalry, beautiful in their pointlessness. The city government's discomfort grew as the towers multiplied. Efforts to regulate their construction came too late, and by the 13th century, Bologna's skyline was already crowded with stone needles. Some officials dreamed of tearing them down, fearing that the towers symbolized disorder more than prestige. Yet the Bologna also profited from its reputation. Visitors brought trade and money, drawn in part by curiosity about the city of towers. The government hesitated to dismantle the symbols of arrogance or exploit them for fame. For a time it chose hesitation, and so the towers remained, glowing faintly at night, like jewels set in brick. The glow itself carried meanings that shifted with the observer. For noble families, it was triumph. For commoners, it was insult. For travelers, it was enchantment. And for chroniclers, it was material, something to describe in tones of admiration, skepticism, or outright mockery. In truth, the moon towers were all of these at once: triumph, insult, enchantment, folly. They lit the night, not with clarity but with contradiction. And so, Bologna lived beneath its constellation of rivalry. Families bickered, towers leaned, servants sweated, citizens muttered, and foreigners marveled. The lamps flickered above, trembling in the wind, casting faint halos against the night. The glow did not make the streets safer or the city more united, but it made Bologna unforgettable. And in the medieval world, memory was power enough. Sliding further into the strange brilliance of Bologna's moon towers, one begins to see how they shaped not only the skyline, but the psychology of the city. Towers were no longer just defensive fortresses or family homes. They were obsessions. Each brick stacked higher than a rival's was a point scored in a game of prestige, and each lamp lit at night was a public boast written against the darkness. Bologna did not simply live with its towers, it lived through them. For noble families, the towers were both crowns and cages. To have one was to announce dominance, but to maintain one was an endless burden. Lamps had to be lit nightly, servants dispatched with jugs of oil, staircases climbed again and again to keep the glow alive. Oil was costly, so every flame that flickered from a high window was also a signal of disposable wealth. To leave a tower dark at night was to admit weakness, a humiliation that no proud family wished to endure. Thus, even in times of hardship, lamps were kept burning, because the glow mattered more than the balance of accounts. The servants who carried this burden did not enjoy the symbolism. For them, the towers meant aching legs, bruised shoulders, and long nights spent stumbling up narrow stairs with heavy loads. Oil sloshed, candles dripped, braziers smoked, all for the sake of a light no one below would ever thank them for. If the flames sputtered out too early, the shame fell not on the family, but on the servant, who bore the blame for tarnishing a nobleman's pride. The glow of the moon towers, so admired by travellers, was therefore built on endless, invisible exhaustion. On the ground, the towers cast their own influence. Their glow gave the streets an eerie half-light, not enough to banish darkness, but enough to make shadows sharper. Narrow alleys seemed even more menacing under their intermittent shine. Citizens looked upward constantly, measuring towers against one another, muttering curses at families whose lamps blazed too brightly. The towers dominated not just the skyline, but conversation, gossip, and resentment. They were at once landmarks and irritants, admired and despised in equal measure. The university students who flocked to Bologna from across Europe added their own commentary. Some praised the towers in their letters home, describing them as marvels. Others mocked them, comparing the families to children stacking blocks too proud to stop. Late at night, after taverns had emptied, the glow of the towers became background to drunken debates. Students pointing upward with cups in hand, laughing at the absurdity of so many noble families locked in vertical competition. The moon towers thus became part of student folklore, inspiring both awe and satire. Travelers, too, left accounts tinged with contradiction. A merchant from Germany wrote of Bologna shining like a city of lanterns, its towers glowing like pillars of fire. A French cleric, less impressed, called the towers proud torches of arrogance, accusing Bologna's nobility of wasting light that might have illuminated churches instead. Both were correct, in their own way. The towers were undeniably beautiful, but their beauty was inseparable from their folly. The city government's patience eventually wore thin as the towers grew more numerous and taller. Regulations became harsher. Some towers were ordered reduced in height, others demolished outright. Families protested, but the government argued that too many towers endangered not only lives, but civic order. By the late Middle Ages, the skyline was thinning, and the glow of the moon towers grew less dense. Bologna was becoming a more ordinary city, its eccentric constellation dimming under the weight of practicality. Yet memory lingered. Even as towers were reduced or dismantled, the image of Bologna as a city of glowing pillars endured. Chroniclers still described it as a place where the night sky seemed inverted, where families lit flames high above their rivals, where wealth was measured not in gold but in wasted oil. The towers may have been fewer, but their legend grew larger. Bologna could never quite shake its reputation as the city of moons. And so, night after night, the remaining towers glowed on, their lamps flickering against the dark, their shadows stretching across alleys. The rivalry persisted, even if muted, and the city continued to live under its strange, shimmering constellation. The towers were fading, but their glow still haunted Bologna, reminding citizens of a time when ambition burned as brightly as flame against the night. Sliding still further into Bologna's peculiar skyline, the towers begin to feel less like eccentric luxuries, and more like uneasy monuments to a city caught between pride and fragility. By the later Middle Ages, the great tower race was slowing, but the structures remained, some leaning, some crumbling, many still lit faintly at night, their glow more stubborn than triumphant. What had once been a booming chorus of light now flickered like a handful of stubborn candles clinging to a drafty room. For the noble families, the towers that survived were both relics and burdens. They still symbolized prestige, but the age of one-upmanship was waning, and maintaining them became increasingly impractical. Stone cracked, mortar crumbled, staircases wore thin. Yet to dismantle a tower was to admit decline, and so families clung to their monuments, even as servants grumbled and citizens muttered about falling bricks. The glow from above was no longer dazzling, it was nostalgic, a reminder of an era when Bologna glittered more extravagantly. Servants continued to shoulder the endless labor, carrying oil up 30 or 40 meters of cramped staircases was not romantic, it was grueling. They trudged upward with clay lamps, careful not to spill, lighting wicks in rooms so drafty, the flames guttered before they caught. From below, passers-by might admire the glow. Inside, sweat dripped, lungs heaved, and tempers frayed. The moon towers were lovely in concept, but in practice they were monuments to exhaustion. The towers also posed hazards that no amount of admiration could disguise. Their height made them lightning rods during storms, and fires remained a constant risk. Collapses did occur, sudden and catastrophic, bringing down not only stone but the reputation of the families who owned them. Each disaster became the city's gossip, retold in taverns and marketplaces with grim satisfaction. Citizens who had long endured the arrogance of glowing towers could hardly resist schadenfreude when one cracked and toppled. Pride built upward, humiliation fell downward. Still, Bologna's towers cast their spell on outsiders. Pilgrims and merchants arriving at dusk described the city as shimmering faintly against the Apennine horizon. Even if fewer towers glowed, the effect was striking. A cluster of slender silhouettes pricked with light, like candles gathered on an altar. Foreigners saw wonder where locals saw folly, and so Bologna's reputation continued to travel farther than its oil supply ever could. Memory, after all, does not measure practicality. It measures spectacle. Meanwhile, life in the streets carried on under this odd constellation. The markets bustled by day, crowded with students, traders, and artisans, while at night, alleys sank into shadow relieved only by the faint glow above. Children grew up, taking the towers for granted, pointing them out playfully, weaving them into rhymes. Lovers met under their silhouettes, imagining the flames above as omens of fortune. Cynics mocked them as lanterns of arrogance, but even the most jaded citizens occasionally lifted their eyes to the flickering skyline and felt, if not admiration, then at least recognition. The towers belonged to Bologna, absurd and fragile as they were. The university students, ever sharp-tongued, kept the satire alive. They compared the noble families to moths fluttering desperately toward their own flames, consuming oil to keep their pride alight. In taverns, songs mocked the towers as chimneys of vanity, jokes that likely stung their owners more than any city ordinance. Yet the same students, stumbling home late at night, admitted that the glowing towers were useful landmarks, guiding them to lodgings when all else was dark. Even folly can have function. The government's attempts to manage the skyline grew more serious as the centuries passed. Some towers were deliberately reduced in height, others dismantled entirely. Practicality finally began to outweigh prestige. The glow of the moon towers diminished, but Bologna's legend as a city of lighted pinnacles was already cemented. To outsiders, the towers defined the city long after their lamps had dimmed, and so Bologna entered a quieter age of towers, less crowded, less flamboyant, yet still haunted by the memory of its shimmering skyline. The surviving structures glowed less brightly, but they carried history in their shadows. They stood as reminders of a time when families competed not only in wealth and influence, but in light itself. burning oil against the night to prove superiority. Even in decline, the towers shaped how Bologna saw itself: proud, eccentric, fragile, glowing faintly in memory. Their flames trembled, but their story endured, illuminating the city long after the lamps themselves had gone dark. Sliding further into Bologna's long twilight of towers, the glow that once screamed of aristocratic rivalry softened into something quieter, almost wistful. The great contests of height were over. The government's interventions and the sheer impracticality of keeping so many stone needles upright had thinned the skyline. Yet a handful remained, stubbornly holding their place above the city, their lamps still lit at night more out of tradition than triumph. For the families who still owned them, these towers had shifted from weapons of rivalry to heirlooms of memory. To light one was to honor ancestors, to keep a lineage's name visible against the dark. The glow no longer declared superiority quite so loudly. It whispered continuity instead. A faint lamp flickering in a high window might not dazzle travelers the way it once did, but it reassured those who lit it that their family still endured, even as fashions and fortunes changed. For servants, the burden remained, though perhaps with less urgency. Carrying oil up spirals of stone was still exhausting, but the ritual had become gentler. Families expected lamps to burn, but fewer neighbors were counting which towers glowed brightest. Pride had dimmed into persistence. The towers were less a contest than a habit, and servants muttered their complaints with slightly less fear. Even so, the glow was never free. It still demanded sweat, oil, and time. In the city below, attitudes had shifted too. Where once the towers were symbols of arrogance, now they began to feel like landmarks of identity. Citizens who had grumbled for centuries now spoke of them with a kind of reluctant pride. They pointed them out to visiting merchants, boasted that Bologna's skyline was unlike any other in Italy, and tolerated their shadows as part of the city's character. Absurd though the towers had been, they had become inseparable from Bologna itself, as much a part of the city's story as its university or markets. Foreign travelers continued to write about them with fascination. By the Renaissance, Bologna's skyline was already thinning, but those who arrived at dusk still noted the odd glow high above. The lamps seemed fragile, quaint even, compared to the grand illuminations beginning to appear in other cities. Yet they carried a charm that could not be denied. To see light so high in a medieval city was still startling, even if it flickered more faintly than before. Bologna's towers had become less boastful and more atmospheric, no longer arrogant moons but gentle lanterns of memory. Yet the danger never entirely disappeared. Towers still leaned, still crumbled, still posed risks in storms. Fires still broke out, sometimes consuming entire upper floors before anyone could respond. Citizens grew more forgiving, however, less quick to curse the towers than in earlier centuries. Accidents became stories of fate, woven into the city's folklore. The tower fell, people would say, shrugging as though it were inevitable, like rain or illness. The glow had shifted from menace to melancholy, from provocation to backdrop. The university students, always quick with irony, adapted their jokes accordingly. No longer mocking families for their arrogance, they teased them for their stubbornness, calling the towers candlesticks of memory or old men leaning on the sky. Songs in taverns still mentioned them, but now with gentler humor, as if mocking an eccentric relative rather than an enemy. The glow of the towers had grown sentimental, softened by the passing of century. By this stage, the moon towers were as much myth as reality. Fewer lamps glowed at night, yet stories of Bologna's luminous skyline grew ever more exaggerated in retelling. Travelers described a forest of glowing spires long after the forest had thinned. Memory outshone the present. The tower's reputation became brighter than their lamps, a constellation preserved not in oil but in imagination. And so Bologna entered a quieter age of towers, their glow faint but persistent. No longer loud with rivalry, they became gentle companions to the night, symbols less of arrogance than of endurance. Citizens walked beneath them with less resentment and more affection, as though the towers, once tyrants of the skyline, had mellowed into guardians of memory. Night after night, the remaining lamps flickered against the dark, their flames smaller, their halos softer, but their meaning richer. The moon towers no longer outshone one another, they outshone time itself, glowing faintly in a city that had learned to live with their folly as part of its soul. And at last, the story of Bologna's moon towers drifts toward its quiet ending. What began as a contest of pride and rivalry, towers stacked brick by brick in a race toward the sky, had by the later centuries become something else entirely: monuments of memory, silhouettes of a past that refused to vanish. Their glow, once flamboyant, faded into something gentler, a faint shimmer lingering in the night like embers of an old fire. The city itself changed around them. Streets widened, new buildings rose, and civic order grew stronger than family rivalry. The great tower race that once defined Bologna gave way to other concerns: trade, scholarship, and the rhythms of daily life in a city known more for its university than its skyline. Yet the towers remained, some leaning precariously, others shortened, many dismantled, but enough still standing to remind everyone of an age when ambition had been written in vertical lines against the sky. The glow of the moon towers, too, lingered in memory long after most lamps had gone dark. Foreigners continued to describe Bologna as the city of glowing towers, even when fewer and fewer lights flickered above its roofs. Travelers arriving at night still found themselves enchanted by the sight of flames trembling in high windows, however sparse. For them, the glow carried not arrogance, but romance, a reminder that even in a world without street lamps, people had found ways to push back the dark, however impractical. The citizens of Bologna grew into a kind of reluctant affection for their towers. What had once been symbols of aristocratic arrogance became part of the city's identity. Children grew up playing in their shadows. Students used them as landmarks. Merchants pointed them out to customers. The towers shifted from irritants to icons. Their glow reframed not as wasted oil, but as stubborn memory. Bologna learned to live with its eccentricity, and in time, even to cherish it. Today, only a fraction of the towers survive, the most famous being the Leaning Esenelli and Garrisenda. Their lamps no longer blaze into the night as they once did, but the legend of the moon towers endures. The idea of Bologna as a city glowing faintly against the medieval dark has become part of its mythology, a story retold by guides and historians, a shimmer preserved in words if not in flame. The towers remind us that cities are shaped as much by folly as by reason, as much by rivalry as by cooperation. The moon towers of Bologna were never practical. They were dangerous, expensive, exhausting, and often ridiculous, but they were unforgettable. They lit the skyline not with generosity, but with rivalry, not for utility, but for spectacle, and yet, in doing so, they gave Bologna a character unlike any other city in medieval Europe. Their glow was arrogance, but also beauty. Their flames were wasteful, but also wondrous. Their fragility was real, but their memory proved stronger than stone. And so, the moon towers endure, if not in their full number, then in imagination. They remind us that history is not only built on monuments of practicality, but also on gestures of extravagance, flickering lights carried high into the night, trembling against the dark, glowing long after their oil has burned away. Bologna's towers may no longer blaze, but their legend still glimmers faint and persistent, like the afterimage of moons that once crowned a medieval city. Silence falls for a moment, but it's only the breath before another storm. Behind the quiet, something stirs, an untold chapter waiting to unfold in all its strangeness. This is the silent watchtowers of the Great Wall, guardians of the northern frontier. Stretching across mountains, valleys, and deserts, the Great Wall of China snakes like a scar stitched into the land. It is not a single wall, but a succession of fortifications built, rebuilt, and patched over centuries, each generation layering its own anxieties in brick and stone. Yet as vast as the wall is, its most haunting features are not the endless ramparts, but the watchtowers, those silent sentinels that rise at intervals, square or round, squat or tall, perched on ridges or planted in valleys. They were the eyes of the frontier, gazing out into the emptiness of the north. Today they stand weathered, abandoned, mute, but once their walls vibrated with voices, smoke, fire, and fear. The towers were never mere ornaments. They were the communication system of a sprawling empire, designed to carry messages faster than any rider could. Smoke signals by day, fire by night, simple codes flickering from tower to tower, relaying warnings across hundreds of miles. If raiders approached from the steppe, the alarm could ripple toward Beijing in a matter of hours, the frontier lighting up like a nervous system firing. The wall itself was meant to slow incursions, but the towers gave the empire ears and eyes. Without them, the wall was just stone. With them, it became a living thing. Each tower was built with practical ruthlessness. Stone and brick where available, tamped earth where not, square structures most often, though round and polygonal shapes appear in certain regions. Some rose only a single story, others several, with stairs or ladders connecting levels. At the top, soldiers tended fires, watched horizons, and shivered in wind. Inside there were cramped quarters, storerooms for grain, cisterns for water, and sometimes armories. The towers were both homes and prisons for the garrisons assigned to them. A few men in each, sometimes dozens, cut off from the world except for the faint silhouettes of other towers in the distance. Life inside a tower was monotonous at best, miserable at worst. Soldiers passed long hours scanning the empty steppe, their eyes straining for the smallest movement. A lone rider could be friend or foe. A dust cloud could mean approaching herds or advancing raiders. Boredom gnawed at them, but so did fear. Stories circulated of surprise attacks, of comrades dragged from walls, of whole garrisons wiped out before help arrived. The towers gave no escape. One could only fight or fall within their walls, and yet soldiers endured because duty demanded it, and because the empire needed human eyes to fill the silence of the frontier. The towers themselves, scattered across harsh landscapes, seemed to share the endurance of the soldiers who manned them. Their walls absorbed centuries of wind and sand, their bricks cracked in heat and frost. Yet, they continued to stand, even as dynasties rose and fell. Minkara bricks carry marks of specific regiments, their names pressed into clay before firing. A faint human presence fossilized into architecture. To touch those bricks today is to touch the hands of forgotten soldiers, men whose names survive only in stamped characters hidden in walls. The system was vast, but fragile. Communication relied on visibility, and visibility relied on weather. A foggy day or a storm could blind the towers, breaking the chain of messages. Fires required fuel, which was scarce on desolate frontiers. Soldiers had to gather brush or haul dung, storing it for nights when signals might be needed. Smoke plumes in the dry northern air carried far, but only if the watchers tended them constantly. The empire's security rested on the diligence of men who lived in towers more exposed than secure. The irony of the Great Wall, of course, is that it was less about keeping enemies out than about containing anxieties within. The watchtowers reflected this perfectly. They were symbols of vigilance, projecting strength. Yet they also revealed fear that without constant watch, the empire's borders would dissolve. The towers did not guarantee safety. They guaranteed nervously. To look out from one was to feel both power and vulnerability. As the steps stretched endlessly, indifferent to bricks and smoke, even in their time, the towers must have felt lonely. Soldiers lived in groups, but their isolation was profound. They sang songs to pass time, carved graffiti into walls, scratched calendars into stone. Some buried trinkets or charms in cracks, perhaps to ward off danger, perhaps to leave traces of themselves. The towers, if they could speak, would not roar with tales of glory, but whisper of monotony, fatigue, and small human gestures against the vastness of frontier life. Today, the watchtowers stand in ruin. Roofs collapsed, walls crumbled, stairways broken, grass grows in their cracks, sheep graze around their bases, and tourists climb them for views. They are silent, but the silence is deceptive. The towers still gaze agate, their openings like eyes staring across the steppe. Across centuries, they no longer light fires or send smoke, but they remain guardians of memory, reminders of an empire's fragile need to watch the horizon. And so the story of the Great Wall's towers begins, not in triumph, but in endurance. They were built to watch, to signal, to endure boredom and storm alike. Their silence today only amplifies their history, for in their mute presence, one can still hear the echoes of footsteps, the creak of ladders, the crackle of firewood, the sighs of men who once stared into endless skies. Drifting further along the ridges and plains, the watchtowers begin to reveal their other purpose beyond smoke and flame. They were way stations of human endurance, scattered like punctuation marks across an unforgiving sentence. To stand in one was to feel the wind whip through narrow slits meant for arrows, to smell the acrid smoke of fuel stockpiled for signals, and to know that you were a speck posted against horizons that stretched without end. The towers dotted landscapes that were anything but uniform. In the west, where the desert sprawled, they rose from dunes, half buried already in sand even during their prime. Soldiers there endured scorching summers and freezing winters, their towers more like ovens by day and iceboxes by night. Water had to be stored in cisterns or hauled from distant wells, each drop precious. A garrison that ran out of water was not a garrison at all. It was a group of doomed men staring at empty buckets. In the mountains, towers clung to ridges like stubborn outcrops. Snow piled against their bases, winds roared through cracks, and storms turned visibility to nothing. The very landscapes that made them strategic also made them punishing. Supply lines often struggled to reach them, leaving soldiers to stretch rations of millet, beans, or dried meat. Fires for warmth risked betraying positions to enemies, so soldiers huddled in layers of felt and fur, muttering about the cold as much as about invaders. The steppe towers faced yet another rhythm. Here the horizon was vast, the dangers swift. Raiders on horseback could appear almost from nowhere, their speed outpacing warnings. A tower might spot dust rising in the distance, light a fire, and already feel hooves pounding nearby. In those moments, the tower was less a signal station than a trap. Soldiers bolted doors, loosed arrows, and prayed reinforcements might follow the trail of smoke before all was lost. Inside the towers, life collapsed into routine. Men kept watch in shifts, eyes scanning for movement until blurred vision and fatigue betrayed them. Others mended bows, sharpened blades, or patched armor that rarely saw use but had to be ready at any moment. Dice games filled evenings, when the fires were not lit. Songs echoed off stone walls, and gossip about distant cities became a lifeline of imagination. A man might never see Beijing, but he could speak of it, dream of it, picture its markets or palaces, while sitting on a frozen stone ledge. Letters home were rare, and even when they arrived, they carried little more than reminders of distance. A wife's health, a child's birth, a poor harvest. News that could not be acted upon, only worried over. For some soldiers, the tower became the only home they would know, the walls as familiar as their families once had been. The monotony etched itself into their bodies, carving lines of fatigue into faces still young, pressing silence into their bones. The architecture of the towers echoed this monotony. Simple rectangles with narrow staircases, floors of packed earth, and walls thick enough to outlast weather. Light entered sparingly through arrow slits. Furnishings were minimal. Straw mats, wooden stools, perhaps a low table. Smoke from cooking fires clung to the ceilings, staining stone with soot. The towers were not built for comfort. They were built to endure, as stubbornly as the soldiers within them. Yet, for all their plainness, the towers were linked to a grand system. Each was part of a chain stretching hundreds of miles. Each garrison connected not by roads but by sight lines. Soldiers might feel isolated, but when they lit a beacon, they joined a chorus of towers, their signal leaping from ridge to ridge, desert to desert, like a pulse of light across the frontier. In those moments, the monotony cracked open into urgency, and the tower remembered its purpose: to make an empire aware of danger before danger swallowed it whole. The towers also served as subtle instruments of psychological warfare. To enemies approaching from the north, their sight alone was a warning. Row after row of towers, standing in grim repetition, projected vigilance, whether manned or not, whether stocked or empty. They gave the impression of a watchful empire, one whose eyes never closed. The silence of the towers was itself a message, a reminder that someone might be watching, even if no smoke rose that day. Time, however, was cruel. Even during their use, towers fell into disrepair. Bricks crumbled, roofs collapsed, and garrisons rotated away, leaving structures abandoned. Some were rebuilt, others left as ruins, half-functioning eyes in a chain that required perfection to work. A single gap in the line could slow messages fatally, reminding everyone that the system was vast, but fragile. And so the towers endured, not as fortresses of glory, but as places of weary duty. They were guardians, yes, but also prisons of monotony, homes of longing, and graves of forgotten men. Their silence today mirrors their silence. Then they did not roar with life, but whispered with watchfulness, waiting always for something that might or might not come, sliding deeper into the lives tied to these silent towers. It becomes clear that they were not only frontier posts, but also symbols of an empire's uneasy balance between vigilance and exhaustion. To man a tower was to live in a place where the line between monotony and terror was razor. A soldier might spend months staring into nothing, only to have one night of chaos undo his routine forever. The towers themselves were not uniform. Along the Ming frontier, for example, some rose 3 or 4 stories, their thick brick walls able to resist both weather and siege. In other regions, especially where stone was scarce, they were rougher, made of tamped earth that eroded easily, requiring constant repairs. Their silhouettes punctuated the wall at intervals, visible enough to carry signals but close enough that no section of the frontier stood alone. To see another tower in the distance was to feel both connection and burden. The knowledge that your fire would trigger theirs, that your vigilance was part of a long, fragile chain. The system of signals was simple in concept, yet its effectiveness depended on discipline. A single column of smoke might mean raiders spotted. 2 might indicate a larger force. 3 might signal invasion. At night, torches or beacons replaced smoke, their flames trembling against the wind. To keep this system alive, towers had to be stocked with fuel wood, brush, dung, sometimes even reeds hauled from faraway wetlands. Soldiers became as much collectors as watchers, scouring the land for anything that would burn. The irony was sharp. To guard against raids, men had to strip their own surroundings bare, leaving little for warmth. Communication could be breathtakingly fast. A warning raised on one end of the wall might travel hundreds of miles in a single day, carried from tower to tower, each beacon answering the last. The Empire relied on this nervous system to respond quickly, shifting troops before raiders could vanish into the steppe. Yet it also revealed constantiety. The wall was less about invincibility than about insecurity, a visible admission that danger pressed always against its northern frontier. Life inside the towers remained harsh. The cramped quarters reeked of smoke and sweat. Grain sacks stacked against walls, long bundles of brush. Rats scurried freely, feeding on crumbs, bold enough to gnaw through leather straps. Men slept in shifts, their dreams punctuated by the creak of wind through arrow slits. Boredom drove them to dice games, carving graffiti, or inventing songs, melancholy tunes that echoed in the cold stone. Some etched poems into walls, fragments of longing for distant homes. Others scratched prayers, hoping divine eyes might relieve their own. The monotony was broken only by drills and sudden alarms. Commanders insisted on regular practice, forcing men to light signals, ready weapons, and march along the walls even when no enemy appeared. Complaints were muttered, but obedience was enforced. Soldiers feared their superiors almost as much as they feared the horizon, knowing that negligence could bring punishment as sharp as an enemy's blade. The towers bred not heroism but discipline, weary and unyielding. To those who lived in villages below, the towers were ambiguous presences. They offered protection, yes, but they also represented burden. Supplies had to be delivered, taxes raised to keep soldiers fed, and sometimes villagers themselves were pressed into repair work. Yet, when raiders appeared, villagers looked to the towers for salvation, hoping the fires would summon help before homes were burned. Fear and resentment coexisted, as much a part of frontier life as the wind itself. Over centuries, some towers became layered with history. New dynasties patched them, added bricks with fresh stamps, or abandoned them altogether. A tower might hold Ming bricks atop Yuan foundations, its walls telling a story of repeated attempts to tame the same frontier. To climb such a tower was to stand among layers of memory, eras of vigilance stacked like the stones beneath one's feet. Now, centuries later, the towers stand hollow, Roofs gone, floors collapsed, their arrow slits gape like blind eyes, yet the silence they hold feels thick, as though the muttered songs, the hurried alarms, the crackling beacons still cling to their walls. They remain watchful, even without watchers, their presence on ridges and plains, reminding all who see them that empires once feared the horizon enough to raise these silent guardians. Sliding further along the crumbling ridges, the watchtowers begin to take on the air of monuments to anxiety, rather than fortresses of triumph. They are, after all, not temples, not palaces, not monuments built to celebrate victories. They were built to prevent disasters, to anticipate them, to live in a state of readiness that was rarely rewarded with glory. The soldiers inside these towers did not expect triumphal parades when their shifts ended. Their best outcome was nothing happening at all. That peculiar emptiness defined frontier life. The very purpose of the towers, to see danger before it arrived, meant that endless days could pass without incident. The soldiers' greatest success was invisibility, their triumph measured in silence. A month without an alarm meant they had done their duty, but it also meant monotony, an erosion of spirit by the sheer weight of waiting. Few men sang songs about boredom, yet boredom was the truest soundtrack of the war. And yet, when alarms came, they shattered the quiet brutally. Imagine a soldier who had stared at horizon lines for weeks, his eyes dulled by dust and fatigue, suddenly spotting a plume of dust or a flicker of movement. Bites the brushwood, smoke climbs skyward, torches are raised at dusk, and suddenly the tower is no longer a lonely box of stone, but the spark that ignites an empire's nervous system. Fires leap tower to tower, beacons answering across valleys, urgency racing through the darkness faster than hoofbeats. For a few moments, the soldier's world expands. He is no longer isolated but connected, his small act of vigilance amplified into a chain of empire-wide consequence. The architecture of these towers reinforced both their utility and their confinement. Thick walls kept out arrows and wind, but they also kept in dampness and smoke. Floors of packed earth absorbed every spill, every grain dropped, every footprint pressed into them. Narrow stairways forced men to climb single file, their heads ducking in passageways, designed for defense rather than comfort. At the top, platforms exposed them to wind, so constant it must have felt like a second skin. To serve in a tower was to live in a place built less for humans than for endurance. The men themselves became as weathered as the bricks around them. Records speak of soldiers serving years in frontier posts, their health eroded by exposure, their morale sagging under endless duty. Some deserted, slipping into villages, abandoning their posts to vanish into anonymity. Others turned bitter, their graffiti carved into walls mocking commanders, or lamenting their fate. The towers absorbed those complaints silently, their stones still carrying faint marks of frustration centuries later. Yet it would be a mistake to see the towers only as prisons. For many, they were also communities, however small. Bonds formed in hardship, forged in shared meals of millet or beans, in shared curses hurled at storms or superior officers. Men joked, sang, told stories of their homes, and sometimes even raised small gardens in patches of soil near the towers. Life was hard, but it was still life, and human resilience carved small comforts from stone monotony. The towers also became places of superstition. Soldiers hung charms above doorways, buried talismans in corners, scratched prayers into walls. Some left offerings at the bases of towers before going on patrols, seeking protection from spirits of the land. The wall was massive, the empire vast, but a single man's fate felt fragile. Superstition filled the gaps that stone and smoke could not. Seen from a distance, the towers projected confidence. They made the wall look unbroken, vigilant, alive. But from within they revealed fragility. Soldiers tired, signals easily disrupted, supplies thin. The empire's strength was less solid than it appeared. Its grand walls stitched together by men living in poverty, monotony, and fear. The watchtowers embodied both faces at once, symbols of empire to outsiders, reminders of vulnerability to those within. Today, standing in one of these ruins, the silence feels heavy. The arrow slits frame horizons once watched with dread, now peaceful in their emptiness. The walls, crumbling, still carry fingerprints of men long gone, men who lit fires, sang songs, and scratched graffiti. The towers no longer signal alarms, but their silence still communicates of endurance, of fragility, of an empire's restless attempt to guard against uncertainty. Sliding deeper into the long rhythm of empire, the watchtowers reveal themselves as both instruments of survival and reminders of futility. No matter how high the wall climbed, no matter how far the towers stretched, the frontier was never truly tamed. The grasslands beyond remained open, vast, and indifferent, and the nomadic riders who crossed them did not respect stone. The towers were the empire's answer to a problem it could not solve. How to sleep at night, knowing the horizon could never be sealed. Soldiers stationed in towers lived at the edge of this paradox. They were sent to guard a boundary that was porous by nature, to watch for movements that could vanish as quickly as they appeared. Raiders on horseback were not armies marching in neat lines. They were dust clouds, swift strikes, sudden disappearances. A signal lit too late was useless, but one lit too early could cause panic and punishment. A soldier's eyes carried the weight of judgment, his hesitation or haste rippling down the chain of fire and smoke. Imagine the pressure of staring into empty plains, knowing a wrong call could bring either disaster or disgrace. In quieter moments, the towers became schools of improvisation. Men patched roofs with whatever scraps they found, wove straw into mats, and built makeshift furniture from discarded timber. They tamed stray dogs to serve as companions and warnings, their barking more reliable than tired eyes at night. Some planted beans or cabbages in corners where soil gathered, coaxing life from stone. These small acts softened the monotony, turning garrisons into faintly human spaces rather than mere stone husks. The diet was relentless in its sameness. Millet porridge, occasionally beans, rarely meat unless hunting provided it. Wine or liquor appeared when supply trains arrived, bringing brief celebration before returning to thin rations. A soldier's body, pressed against wind and stone, carried both hunger and fatigue, yet it endured. The towers demanded endurance more than valor, persistence more than glory. Discipline was constant, enforced by inspections. Commanders rode the wall, checking supplies, drilling signals, ensuring men did not slip into negligence. Punishments for failure could be severe, ranging from beatings to dismissal, sometimes worse. Yet behind the facade of discipline lay exhaustion. Letters and reports from the Ming era complained constantly of underpaid, underfed soldiers, of towers manned by men barely fit to fight. The empire needed eyes on the frontier, but it was never generous in feeding them. Still, when danger appeared, the towers proved their worth. Raiders were not stopped by walls alone, but alarms carried by fire forced the empire to respond. Reinforcements moved, patrols shifted, and sometimes entire campaigns were launched because of one plume of smoke spotted from a lonely tower. In that sense, the towers were both small and vast, tiny structures that could ripple into movements of armies. Their silence was deceptive. They could, in a single flare, awaken an empire, but the cost was high. Many towers fell before help arrived. Raiders struck swiftly, cutting down garrisons, burning supplies, and vanishing before reinforcements approached. For those trapped inside, the tower became tomb as often as refuge. Some ruins today still carry scorch marks, reminders of sieges that ended in flames. The towers endured, but the men inside often did not. To stand in one now, centuries later, is to feel that tension. The silence is deep, but it does not feel empty. The arrow slits still frame horizons. The stairways still lead upward to platforms exposed to wind, and the stones still hold the weight of footsteps long gone. They were built to be watchful, and even in ruin they still watch. The watchtowers were, in the end, symbols of empire's restless vigilance. They did not end raids, they did not secure eternal peace, but they bought time, delayed disaster, and gave the illusion of control, and perhaps that illusion was as valuable as the function itself, for to see the fires lit across the hills was to believe the empire was alert, that it was not blind to the dangers pressing in. And so the towers endured, practical, harsh, haunted. They were guardians of the frontier, not because they guaranteed safety, but because they embodied the act of guarding itself, endless, repetitive, and never complete. Sliding onward along the worn line of stone, the towers take on another dimension. They were not just instruments of defense, but symbols of dynastic ambition. Each dynasty that rebuilt or repaired the wall stamped its own anxieties into these structures, leaving behind bricks with marks of regiments, inscriptions of commanders, and subtle differences in design. To climb a tower today is to climb through layers of dynastic memory, and foundations beneath Tang repairs, beneath Ming brickwork, an archaeological palimpsest of worry. The Ming dynasty left the most enduring mark, facing repeated threats from the steppe. Ming rulers poured enormous resources into strengthening the wall and its towers. Bricks were stamped with the names of units responsible for their production, a bureaucratic way of both ensuring accountability and leaving ghostly signatures for the future. To run one's hand along a weathered brick is to touch the imprint of forgotten men, soldiers and laborers who carried clay, fired kilns, and stacked courses of stone under orders that stretched from the capital. The towers were not only watchpoints, they were monuments to administrative reach. Every brick a line in the empire's ledger for the soldiers posted there. However, such grandeur meant little. Their lives remained grounded in mud, millet, and monotony. Yet they were aware of being part of something larger. When a tower lit its beacon, it was not just summoning reinforcements, but activating a vast chain of imperial response. The empire was a distant abstraction most of the time, but in those moments, the soldier's torch linked him directly to the capital, his act echoing all the way to the emperor's ear. The tower turned isolation into connection, however brief. The landscapes themselves shaped how towers were built and remembered. In the deserts, towers were squat, their lower walls already half swallowed by shifting sands. In the mountains, they stood tall, perched precariously on ridges where snowstorms battered their sides. Along river valleys, they rose from fertile soil, often near villages that provided supplies, their presence woven into the rhythms of agriculture. Each tower, though uniform in purpose, carried the imprint of its environment, as though the land itself whispered into its stones. Over time, neglect set in. Dynasties fell, priorities shifted, and towers that once blazed with smoke signals stood empty. Some collapsed into rubble, their bricks scavenged for homes or pens. Others lingered in partial ruin, their upper stories gone, their lower chambers repurposed as storage for shepherds or shelter for travelers. In some places, children played inside their hollow shells, turning monuments of vigilance into playgrounds of imagination. The empire's anxieties faded, but the towers persisted, half forgotten yet still standing. Their silence today carries a strange irony. Built to be loud with fire, smoke, and alarm, they now mutely watch horizons that no longer threaten. The dust clouds that once terrified garrisons are now stirred by tourists' buses or herders' flocks. The arrow slits that once framed approaching enemies now frame peaceful skies, and yet their watchfulness lingers. Even ruined, they still face outward, as though the act of vigilance has outlived its necessity. It is tempting to see them as tragic remnants, but perhaps they are more than that. They embody endurance structures designed for fear that have outlasted the fears that birthed them. They embody human stubbornness, the refusal to leave a frontier unwatched, even when history proved walls cannot halt the tides of migration. And they embody memory, the faint scratches of graffiti, the stamped bricks, the soot stains from long dead fires, all whispering of lives once lived within their confine. Thus, in their silence, the towers still perform their role. They guard not against raiders, but against forgetting, reminding all who see them of the restless vigilance that once consumed empires. Their stones, cracked and weathered, hold centuries of looking outward, watching, waiting, enduring. Sliding further into the silence of these towers, one begins to notice how memory clings to them more tightly than mortar. They are not simply ruins of defense, they are archives of human presence. Each wall and stair bearing faint traces of the men who once lived and died within them. Unlike palaces which were decorated with splendor, or temples which were consecrated with ritual, the watchtowers carried only the ordinary touch of ordinary hands, soldiers, laborers, commanders, all leaving behind marks they never expected to last. Some of these marks are literal. Bricks from the Ming period often carry incised characters naming the regiment or province that produced them. Each stamp a small bureaucratic record pressed into clay. These stamps, faint and weathered, still survive on certain towers, like signatures left by men whose names were otherwise lost. Graffiti too survives. Crude carvings of dates, names, even sketches. A soldier in the 16th century, bored or lonely, scratching his identity into stone, could never have imagined tourists tracing those same lines with their fingers centuries later. The towers became unintentional guestbooks of empire. Other marks are subtler. Dark stains on ceilings from cooking fires, grooves worn into steps by boots trudging up and down, soot smudges where torches once flared, all small reminders of the everyday. The towers did not only serve empire, they served dinners, arguments, dice games, and weary naps. Their stones absorbed all of it, storing traces of lives that history rarely bothers to record. In this sense, the towers are strangely democratic. Unlike palaces or temples, which reflect only the grandeur of rulers or the devotion of elites, the watchtowers tell the story of common soldiers, anonymous men who spent their lives in vigilance. The empire may have commanded their labor, but the towers preserve their presence. In the silence of a ruined tower, one can almost hear the shuffle of boots, the mutter of complaints, the sigh of men watching an endless horizon. Yet, The towers also remind us of impermanence. For all the labor invested, many fell quickly into ruin once dynasties collapsed. Bricks were pried loose by villagers for houses, stones carted away for pens and walls, timbers burned for war. What had once been an imperial system of surveillance became a scattering of shelters, storerooms, and ruins. The towers were both durable and disposable, built to last centuries, yet abandoned as soon as their purpose evaporated, and still they stand. Not all, of course. Many have crumbled entirely, buried in sand or collapsed into valleys, but thousands remain, dotting the landscape with their skeletal forms. They no longer signal alarms, but they still communicate to modern eyes. They speak of endurance, of fragility, of the endless human impulse to guard against uncertainty. They remind us that vigilance itself can become architecture, that fear can be built in brick and stone. Even in ruin, their orientation endures. The arrow slits still face outward, narrow eyes fixed on horizons that once carried threat. The platforms still rise above surrounding land, commanding views of valleys and ridges. To stand in one is to adopt the posture of vigilance, to see the world as soldiers once saw it, an expanse of possibility and danger. The towers have lost their voices, but not their gaze. Perhaps that is their most haunting quality. Their silence does not feel like absence, but like restraint, as if they are still holding watch, waiting for signals that will never come, guarding a frontier that no longer needs guarding. They are obsolete, but they refuse to admit it. Their stones continue to perform the role given to them, centuries after the empire that built them has dissolved. And so the watchtowers of the Great Wall linger as guardians, not of borders, but of memory. They do not protect an empire anymore, but they protect the story of what it meant to try, to build, to fear, and to endure. Their silence is not emptiness. It is testimony, spoken without words, carried in stone, still watch. And so the watchtowers linger, scattered like weathered punctuation across the long line of the Great Wall. Their stones have lost their roofs, their stairways crumble into heaps, their arrow slits gape like tired eyes. But they remain. They no longer signal raids, no longer light the sky with plumes of smoke or flame. Yet their silence carries a weight as heavy as their past alarms. To stand inside one today is to feel time layered in dust. The floor crunches with fragments of brick. The walls are tattooed with graffiti from centuries of hands. And the view from the top frames horizons that once seemed threatening, but now lie peaceful. Tourists take photographs. Shepherds graze animals nearby, and wind whistles through openings that once channeled vigilance. The towers have traded their role as guardians of empire for that of monuments to memory. They remind us that empires build not only for glory, but for fear. Palaces speak of triumph, temples of devotion, but the watchtowers speak of anxiety, an empire that could not rest, that built eyes along its skin to stare outward forever. They whisper of monotony, too, of soldiers pacing narrow rooms, muttering into the dark, waiting for signals that might never come. And they murmur of futility, for walls cannot stop the tides of migration, nor can smoke signals silence the steppe. Yet, they also embody endurance. Long after dynasties crumbled, after capitals shifted and empires dissolved, the towers still stand. Their purpose has evaporated, but their presence persists. They no longer connect soldiers in a chain of vigilance, but they connect centuries in a chain of memory. They remind us that human attempts to control the uncontrollable leave traces, and that even structures born of fear can outlast the fears themselves. The watchtowers of the Great Wall are silent now, but silence is not absence. It is testimony. In their mute stones one can still sense the echoes of firewood crackling, soldiers coughing in smoke, hooves drumming across distant plains, and the anxious breath of an empire staring outward into uncertainty. They remain guardians, not of borders, but of memory, standing watch, not over raiders, but over history itself. May this story settle in your heart like a whisper, and may your dreams be calm and kind. Good night.